Hi, everyone. This is Austin Rizzo from the Clark Group. At this point, we're just waiting on Andrea from NBRC to start the meeting. So I think they must be running a little bit late. So we'll give them a few minutes. I'm going to reach out to them and then we'll get started. Thanks. Hi, Andrea.
Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the delay. I think we've got a couple people that somehow we ended up with 2 meetings, so we had folks in a different room. So I gave them a few minutes to re-register and come in over here. So hopefully we will be good and we will get started momentarily, and appreciate folks' patience. Technical challenges on a Monday. Good times.
Will happen.
Right. I think we are good, and I will continue to watch and make sure people get into the meeting. So good afternoon. Again, apologies for the delay in us getting started. This is session number 2 for the Northern Border Regional Commission Spring Round New Grantee Training Session. We are covering a couple of high priority important topics today. The first is the National Environmental Policy Act, so NEPA. We are going to talk about environmental reviews, and then we will also be doing a segment on our Build America, Buy America Act, which for some is kind of a relatively new requirement. We thought it was important early on in the process to make sure our grantees were aware of these requirements, kind of what it means for you as your project begins to move forward. And so today I'm going to pull up my slide deck, just letting folks know. I think you probably got the notification that this session is being recorded. Austin, you can see my screen deck, my slide deck, I assume, correct?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. So I mentioned today that just a couple of housekeeping pieces is that we are recording this session similar to session 1. The slide deck and the recording will be posted on the resources tab of our website. So there are 5 sessions in total. This is the second one. We do have folks' microphones muted at this time. Certainly feel free to use the chat if you end up having any sort of technical difficulties, but we have built in multiple question and answer opportunities, and will not be using the chat for purposes of that for today. So microphones are muted until we get to the Q&A time, and then you're certainly free to raise your hand or come off mute and ask your question, and certainly the use of your camera is optional. We will be posting this on our website. Last week I had it up, I think the day after. So we will look to get this slide deck and the recording on our website very soon, with the goal that it's going to be a resource for you, not just today, but as your project moves forward. So I mentioned that we will be talking about NEPA. We have Austin Rizzo of the Clark Group with us today to do the presentation on NEPA. The Clark Group has been an environmental consultant for NBRC for the last couple of years, and Austin serves as our primary point of contact. And then our staff attorney, our grant attorney, Rebecca Dramashkin, will be presenting on the Build America, Buy America. And in between those sessions, we will have a Q&A, and then we will have a final Q&A at the end in the event there's something related to your project that you are you have questions about, but might not be necessarily related to the topics that we've outlined today. And with that, I will turn it over to Austin.
Okay. Andrea, would you like me to open up a Q&A after my session, or do you want to just wait till the end?
We'll do a Q&A after your session. I'll be listening and monitoring, but yes, I built a Q&A time in for you before we start on the next session.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. I'm going to turn off my camera because not going to be looking at it, and then try to figure out how to share. Oh, how do you share?
So top right corner, there's a
Oh, I
button.
gotcha.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm a
And
little
you should
rusty on
have,
Teams.
yeah, you should have sharing privileges and I've stopped sharing. So you should be good.
Okay.
I see it.
All right, let me
Thank you.
just switch. Okay, can you see my slides without my notes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so as Andrea mentioned, my name's Austin Rizzo. I'm in an environmental consultant group called the Clark Group. And so what our group specializes in is environmental compliance matters. So as part of my team, I have Patrick Blanchard, who's here on the call today. We also have Sarah LeClaire, and we have the president and CEO of the Clark Group, Lisa Mahoney. So the four of us work together to process all of our NBRC projects and to ensure that NBRC and you, the grantee, are environmentally compliant. So specifically what we look to do is to ensure that NBRC is compliant with the NEPA statute. Some of you may have heard of this statute before. And if you haven't, that's no big deal because we're going to be going over it today. So basically what's important to note here is that NEPA, being compliant with NEPA is necessary for all NBRC funded projects. And so that's why we're covering it today. It's going to be a very, very important first step for your project. So what we're going to be going over today is what is NEPA and why is it important? And then also, what does the NEPA process look like for you? As far as time requirements, that you're going to have to think about in terms of funding. So we're going to cover all of that today. Okay, so NEPA. NEPA stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. It was created in the US back in 1970 with the goal of promoting the protection, preservation, and enhancement of the environment. So NEPA was enacted basically in response to growing concerns over environmental impacts of large-scale development projects. So think about projects such as dams, highways, industrial facilities. There are many, many big projects going on about this time. So around this same time period, there were several environmental disasters that were occurring across the US. And all of these kind of acted in one culminating event that ended up shaping environmental protection in the US. And many of these environmental protections still stand today. So just to give you kind of an idea of the types of environmental disasters we're talking about, 1969, Santa Barbara had an oil spill, dumped over 100,000 barrels of oil into the Southern California waters. Then the Cuyahoga River burning in Ohio. This is a picture on the screen. This wasn't the first time this river is burnt. It burnt several other times before that, and the reason why it ended up burning is because of the thick amounts of industrial waste that covered the surface of the river. Around the same time, we also had the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Some of you may have heard of this book. What's so important about this book was that it was really geared towards the general public. It brought to light these environmental concerns caused by the pesticide DDT. And it wasn't just focused on, what are these pesticides doing to the environment, like the creatures and the habitat out there, but it's also what are these pesticides doing to the US? What is this doing to humans? So all of this kind of happened at the same time, and what we ended up having back in the 1970s, pretty much passing almost at the same time, was we had NEPA, so National Environmental Policy Act. We had Endangered Species Act. We had the Clean Air Act. We had the Clean Water Act. These are just a few. And at the same time, we had the Environmental Protection Agency being formed at the same time. So what is the primary purpose of NEPA? It's basically to ensure that federal agencies consider the environmental effects of their proposed action before before they actually move forward with the project. So it's the whole NEPA does not dictate that a federal agency take a certain action. It does not dictate that a federal agency take the most benign action that's going to impact the environment the least. What it does make sure that we do for federal agencies is that they take a really hard look at what their project's impacts are going to be. And they consider mitigation measures and best management practices. And based off of all of that information, then they make a decision. But the critical word here is before. So before that money is spent, before an action's taken, this hard analysis needs to occur. All right, so yeah, we'll move on to the next slide. So NEPA is oftentimes referred to as an umbrella statute because it encourages federal agencies to incorporate other environmental or historic preservation requirements into the analysis. The point here is that all of these requirements, all of these regulations need to occur. And so instead of doing them all separate, we basically bundle them under NEPA. And so what's interesting about these other federal requirements is that they basically say NEPA doesn't have teeth. And what that means is NEPA on its face alone does, like, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't dictate that we take a certain action or that we not take a certain action. It just is basically, NEPA just ensures that we go through a process. But these other federal requirements, they do have what they call legal teeth. So there are, let's say, the Endangered Species Act. There are requirements that we cannot take a federally listed species and harm it without, like there are just certain things that we have to follow with some of these other regulations. And so by kind of nesting them under the NEPA umbrella, it in a way gives NEPA teeth. There are some things that we're going to have to strictly abide by. So for NBRC projects, some of the typical additional federal requirements that we run into will be floodplain and wetlands. We have to do what's called an 8-step requirement. We'll go into these a little bit more. So that's going to be an additional requirement that we're going to do along with the NEPA process. We also have endangered species. So if your project involves cutting down a lot of trees in an area where federally listed bats are, we're going to have to do a consultation. Okay, that's one of those requirements that we can't get out of. And then we also have cultural resources. If your project has any ground disturbance, or if you have a building that's over 50 years old and you want to do renovation work, we're going to have to do a Section 106 consultation. So I just wanted to mention some of these other ones because as we're going through the NEPA process, we will be considering some of these other federal statutes. All right, so what triggers NEPA? So the primary driver for triggering a NEPA analysis is the undertaking by a federal government of a major federal action. Keyword here is federal. Okay, so this applies to federal projects. NEPA is it is specific to federal projects. So if a federal agency is undertaking a major federal action, that agency must consider the potential impacts on the human environment. So that's basically what NEPA is. The word or the term or the phrase major federal actions, I think can be a little bit misleading. Major indicates to me like a huge project, but actually what this means is any activity that is undertaken or completed, funded, authorized, or approved by a federal agency, that is a major federal action. So it can be very minor. A major federal action can be replacing a roof, or it can be something huge like building a new, a whole new building. That could be a major federal action. So for NBRC, the real trigger here for our projects are that your projects are funded by NBRC. So even though NBRC itself is not undertaking the project, they are funding the project. And so because of that, this is triggering NEPA. And so we will move forward. So let's actually come back a little bit. One thing I mentioned is that we need to take a look at the impacts of the project on the human environment. That is another phrase that I think is a little confusing. A lot of times people think of NEPA, they think of environmental compliance as just looking at the impacts on the habitat, the critters out there. But what we are looking at is a lot more comprehensive. We're looking at something called the human environment. And so it's not just the impact of your project on species or, habitat, it's also the impacts of your project on your next door neighbor or the community. Those are things that we're going to be taking a look at. So I came up with this graphic here just kind of show you some of the impacts that we're going to be looking at to show you a little bit about what this analysis looks like, just so you get a better sense of like how comprehensive of a review we're doing. So here in the middle, this shows a hypothetical NBRC project where they are going to replace some water and sewer lines in town that have needed replacing for a while. So the project scope or the description of the project is going to be that they're going to come in, they're going to dig up the road, they're going to pull out the old pipes, they're going to install new pipes, and then they're going to put the road back together. So in terms of impacts, first thing that we're going to note is that the road's going to have to be closed down for a little bit in order to do this. All right, so we're going to need to look at the impacts on traffic, on parking. What is the impacts on local businesses for this road closure? We also have some heavy equipment that's going to be brought in that's very noisy. So this is a project that's occurring in town. So we're going to need to look at impacts on residential houses. One important thing to note is that we look at impacts of a project, but in doing so, we also are going to consider the impacts of mitigation and best management practices. So when we're looking at impacts, it's not just that, yes, the equipment's noisy. We're going to say, yes, the equipment's noisy, but we're going to follow the town's noise ordinances. We're not going to be working in the middle of the night. And because of that, we don't think there's going to be a huge impact on residential houses because, people aren't going to be mostly sleeping during the middle of the day. So when we're doing our analysis, we are wrapping mitigation measures and best management practices into that. Moving along this graphic, we have an old cemetery. So we're going to be doing a lot of ground disturbance. So we want to make sure that there are no impacts to this old cemetery. We have some forest nearby with some migratory birds that nest during the summer. We have to consider the effects of noise on them. And maybe there are very minimal impacts, and that's totally fine. But the important thing here is that we're taking a look at it. We're acknowledging that there could be an impact, before we move forward. All right, so there aren't any assumptions here. We actually take a good look at all of these resources. We also have a little river that runs through town. We know that we're going to be disturbing soil. Soil with rain mixed is not a good combination, so there's a potential for erosion and runoff into these aquatic resources. So again, bringing back to those mitigation measures, are we going to be making sure that they install silt fences? Any other best management practices that is going to help prevent that erosion and impact to the aquatic resources. Finally, if we move down to this one corner, we have an old contaminated site near the project. And this is another important thing that I think a lot of times people forget with NEPA. It's not just looking at the impacts of the project on the surrounding human environment. It's looking at the impacts of the environment sometimes on your project. So let's say if we were actually installing a playground here for little kids to play on, and we have a contaminated site. Well, we need to think, well, if we're digging into the soil, do the construction workers have a potential to be impacted by this contamination? Do the kids playing on the playground in the future have any, do we have to worry about, the impacts of this contamination on their human health? All right, so we're looking at it both ways. And so that's why these analyses can take a long time sometimes and also, be quite comprehensive. And I think some people get pretty frustrated with the NEPA process. You're thinking, I have such a small project. How can this have much for impact? But it's really, I think, important to just take a step back and acknowledge that there are thousands of projects occurring around the US in any given day. And if you look back to the 1970s, the reason why the Cuyahoga was burning wasn't one project alone. It was several different development projects that were occurring that basically ended up in a cumulative impact to that river. And so if we think about all these tiny projects across the US, I mean, you could, if you don't have those mitigation measures and if you weren't taking a hard look before you leap, you could end up with like death by 1,000 cuts across the US. And so that's why, I think it helps when you think about kind of, why this process can be so laborious sometimes. It's good to take a step back and understand the bigger picture behind why we need to do it. I think maybe it makes it a little less painful. All right, so the levels of NEPA analysis. So there are 3 different levels of NEPA analysis. Basically, there's easy to hard. So the first level is called the categorical exclusion, or a CADEX. And so this is a type of project that has been predetermined by the federal agency not to have a significant impact on the human environment. So a lot of people think a CADEX isn't NEPA, or it's like a waiver or exemption from NEPA. It actually isn't. It's a form of NEPA. You are complying with NEPA requirements if you end up having a project that falls under a CADEX. What's important to note here is that every federal agency has its own categorical exclusion list. So that's a subset of projects that federal agency has determined would not result in significant impacts. And so if you've worked with USDA in the past, or Housing and Urban Development, HUD, their CADEX list is going to be different than NBRC's CADEX list. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. So anyway, CADEX, this is the easiest version of NEPA. This is the one that you really want if you had a choice. Level 2 is an environmental assessment. So basically, if your project doesn't fall under a CADEX category, and you don't really know the impacts of your project, but they're not anticipated to be significant, you would end up needing to do an EA, or an environmental assessment. At the end of your EA, if you determine that ultimately your project wouldn't result in significant impacts, we end up proceeding with what's called a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI. And it's basically a document just saying like, hey, we looked at the project and based off of everything we analyzed, we don't think there's significant impacts. And then that allows you to move forward with the project. If, however, you get to the end of that EA and you're like, wow, things are looking pretty bad, there are definitely some significant impacts, this would bump you up to requiring an environmental impact statement. And these are much more comprehensive analyses. These are longer analyses, they take longer. And what's fortunate here is for NBRC, we have not run into this situation before. So today we are just going to be focusing on these first 2. So that's good news. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that at least CADEX lists vary among federal agencies. But I do want to just talk about NEPA as a whole being implemented differently across different federal agencies. And the reason why I'm bringing it up today, and I haven't brought it up in the past, is because we oftentimes run into grantees who have gotten funding from other federal agencies, and they're very confused why the process looks different for NBRC. And this is I just want to make kind of just go over why it looks different, and just kind of catch this from the beginning. So basically, each federal agency will implement NEPA differently, and they're required to basically take the NEPA statute and bring it down to create their own procedures and guidelines that are very specific to the types of projects that they fund. All right, so because of that, we end up with, first off, that different CADEX list. So you may have a project that if USDA was funding the project, you may be able to CADEX the project. But let's say NBRC is funding the project, you may not be able to CADEX the project. So you could have the exact same project that could be CADEXed under one federal agency, but not another. And I, again, know that's very frustrating for sure, but these are one of these situations, these requirements that they are mandatory and they can't be circumvented. So that is just the list we are dealt, basically. The other thing that's very important to note is that the NEPA process, like actually creating NEPA documents, will look very different between the different federal agencies. So one agency's EA might be 10 to 12 pages long, might look more like a form or an Excel, whereas NBRC's EAs and many other federal agencies' EAs look to be around 50 or 60 pages of a more detailed analysis. And so the reason why for NBRC we've chosen this other route is because, I mean, if you think about like all of the resources, that graphic that I went on over back there are a lot of different things to consider, and to really be thorough in your analysis and to make sure that you're not going to have a big impact on the environment, we need to actually do some detailed analysis, and you're not going to get that from a 10 to 12 page paper. We really just to ensure that NBRC is compliant, to make sure we're not having a big impact on the environment, we opt for a more traditional environmental assessment approach. So again, that's NBRC's procedures, and that's something, again, if you've gone through HUD or another agency, it's just going to look a little bit different. Okay, so we're going to move on to what a typical CADX looks like for NBRC versus a project that's going to require an EA. So recently, as of this year, NBRC has applied a new CADX list that they are now using. In the past, NBRC is a relatively new federal agency, so because of that, they have not come up with their own procedures quite yet, but we are very near to doing this. And so in order to actually move forward with being able to allocate funds, they had to use another federal agency's procedures. And so originally we went off of the housing and urban development procedures because their projects seemed fairly similar to NBRC. However, after using that list for several years, we kind of realized it wasn't as aligned with NBRC's work as we initially thought. It really was. We had a lot of projects that we were like, we really feel like we should be able to CADX them because they're not going to result in significant impacts. And so the last year we did a little shopping around for other federal agencies, and we found the Denali Commission. And they have a very similar mission to NBRC. And because of this, we ended up, this is not something easy. You can't just like flip flop from between agencies as you want. You actually have to go through a very formal process with the Council of Environmental Quality, which is the agency that basically oversees NEPA. And so we work closely with CEQ, or the Council of Environmental Quality, to basically adopt the Denali Commission's CADX list for the time being. And because of this, we believe we're going to be able to CADX a lot more projects that we have in the past. So generally speaking, this is really good news for our grantees. So today I just want to this is going to be a very broad overview. There are a lot of nuances that we're not going to cover here. But generally speaking, if you have projects that, let's say, renovation, replacement, maintenance, as long as that does not change the functional use of the property, that can be a project that could be CADXed. What I mean by changing the functional use of the property, let's say it's an old office building, you want to renovate it to be an apartment complex where people live, that's changing the functional use. That goes from office space to living space. So if you're not doing that, if you're just changing an office space to office space, you're just renovating it, that could potentially be CADXed. Demolition projects, as long as they're not a National Register of Historic Preservation eligible structures, so if they're not really old, that can typically be CADXed. If you're doing a small addition and the addition's on adjacent disturbed land, so that's land that's been graded, messed with kind of in the past, that could be a CADX project. Acquisition and installation of equipment. So let's say you have your, you want to get some snowmaking equipment, so snow machine, like guns, that could be something that we potentially could CADX. And then finally, some small new construction projects. So this is a really unique one. This is a new one from past years, but as long as again, it's on previously disturbed land and it's pretty small, this could be something that we CADX. I'm not going to really go into it here, but as I said, this is a very big generalization. There are a lot of other federal requirements that we have to look at in addition to this. As I mentioned, we have to make sure we're compliant with the Historic Preservation Act, Endangered Species Act, things like that. So we have to do an additional check. So a project can be CADX and still have some additional requirements. We'll go over that in a little bit. So it's not always just a CADX or an EA. There's kind of this middle ground in here that we oftentimes play in. In terms of projects that need EAs, I've kind of just flipped some of those projects that require CADXs. So renovations, if it changes the functional use of the property, it's going to require an EA. Demolition, if it's on an National Register of Historic Places or eligible places, probably need EA. Additions on undisturbed lands, EA. And then any larger new construction. Yeah, so again, these are just generalizations. We have a really long CADX list with, again, a lot of nuances in here that we have to, every time we get a new project. So once we get all your projects in, we assess them. We will basically look over that list pretty thoroughly to determine if your project's a CADX or if it's an EA. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of time? For a CADX project, this is the one I said, if you had your pick, you'd want your project to fall under a CADX. The reason behind that is because these typically take a very little time. You're looking at sometimes if it's a simple CADX with no additional federal requirements, it can be, 1 day it takes us to process. If you have, maybe you have to do a Section 106 because you're renovating an old building, maybe we're looking at a month to a month and a half in order to complete the consultation in addition to your CADX. So generally speaking, we're looking at a month to less than a month to process a CADX. Additionally, there is no public comment period. Unless, again, if there are other federal requirements. So let's say you're renovating a building, it's in a floodplain, there will be a public comment period associated with that additional requirement. But generally speaking, even with those public comment periods, we're looking at less than a month. The EA, on the other hand, this is a robust review. We're looking at least 6 to 12 months to develop. At the end of that, you have a 30-day public comment period. And so altogether, this is, a much more laborious process, takes just a lot more time and a lot more resources in order to accomplish. All right, so we're going to go over what the NEPA process looks like. So you've determined you've filled out your NEPA intake form, and we're going to go over that in a little bit briefly. So that if we just look at this graphic here to the left, you have a proposed renovation project. You, the grantee, will complete the NBRC NEPA intake form. Important here is that you're going to tell us a little bit, actually quite a bit, about your project and the environment around your project. Those are the things that we really need in order to make a NEPA. It's called the NEPA determination. Basically saying, does your project require a CADX or does it require an EA? So as soon as we get your intake form, we're going to look over it. And the first thing we'll do, we'll say CADX or EA. And then we'll look and see if there's additional federal requirements. So does it need a Section 106 because there's ground disturbance or you're dealing with an old structure? Does it need Section 7 because let's say you're cutting down forest in a federally listed bat habitat? Or does it need an 8-step analysis because your project might impact floodplains or wetlands? All right, so that's what we mean by making a NEPA determination, and that is the first step. So let me pause here. I'm going to pull up the NEPA intake form. This is an example from a past grantee, and I think they did a pretty good job of filling out the form, which is why I pulled it up. So up at the top here, you can see the grantee, point of contact information. This section right here is very, very important. And a lot of times I don't see it filled out very well, but it is very, very important and can really help streamline the process if we can have this filled out correctly. So NBRC oftentimes is a co-funder to some of these projects with other federal agencies or other state agencies. And sometimes those agencies have their own NEPA process or own NEPA-like process that we can piggyback on. So instead of having to do NEPA twice or, anything like that, that we could actually have the potential to piggyback off of what someone else has done, or we can work cooperatively with them. And oftentimes some of these agencies have already started the process ahead of us getting the process. So it can really quicken up the process if we can figure this information out. So you can see here, they did a decent job of filling out who the other agency was. They have a couple different agencies they were working with. But they are missing like point of contact name, email address, and that would have been really helpful because with that information, we can actually reach out to the person, the other agency, instead of having to ask you to go find that information and go ask those questions, we can actually do that ourselves. So that just takes some of the burden off of you. Down here, however, you will see, we did ask, is the NEPA process currently underway? And they did actually answer this really nicely. So they showed, yes, USDA is actually in the process of NEPA. They're working with the state. They put their point of contact email information in. So for this project, we actually reached right out to USDA and we were able to, they had already completed the NEPA process. So we were able to adopt what they had done. And that quickened this project up by about 8 months, probably. I'm not going to go through the whole NEPA intake form, but there are a series of questions in here about your project. I'm going to move down here to the project description. The location, that's a huge thing. We actually have a number of databases online where we can visually inspect your project to get a better idea of other federal requirements that are necessary. So if you provide a really accurate location information for us, we can do that analysis on our end without having to go back to you and ask additional questions, which again, just adds more time to the process. So here, these guys were great. They gave us an address and they gave us GPS coordinates to actually show us where the project footprint would be. So that's like the perfect example of what we would love if we had our way. Other thing that we have down here is the project description. They were great. They gave us some dimensions that we could look at. They just detailed what was going to go on with their project. The more information you provide on the actual, like, what are you doing construction-wise on the ground, the better. That's really what we're looking for. Again, if you don't fill this out very accurately, we're going to have to come back to you and ask questions, and that just adds time. So the more information you can put in here, the better. We also have some additional project questions. Some of these have to do with the work that you're doing. Others have to do with more of the environment around the project site. Again, try to do your best in answering the questions. Some of these have follow-up questions, and they basically, if you can add an explanation in, that's super helpful. The more information you can provide to us, the better. If you're unsure, put unsure, maybe explain why you're unsure or like kind of what your thought process is. And that'll help us a lot. So yeah, these guys did a really good job. So we're gonna move back to the PowerPoint. All right, so we just went over the first step, which is filling out the NEPA intake form and making a NEPA determination. The second step is to actually move forward with creating the documents. So we're going to go to the easiest scenario first, which is your project fell under a CADX. And so we're going to process this as a CADX, your project as a CADX. So what's good about this scenario is that the Clark group or the group I work with, we're going to be solely responsible for filling out these materials. So basically, once we get your NEPA intake form, we're going to start moving forward with the CADX determination if it falls under a CADX. And if your project does have any other federal requirements, for instance, you're renovating an old building and we need to do Section 106 consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, we're going to do that for you. All right, so this is, again, an ideal scenario. It really takes all the work off of your plate. That's what a CADX looks like. So now we're going to move on to the harder scenario. Oh, actually, we have a slide between here. So I did mention the other federal requirements. I want to go into these a little bit more because these are super common to run into this. So for this example here, if we were renovating this apartment structure, this is in Mount Pelier, Vermont. They like to build on the river. Because it's right there on the river, it's in a floodplain, we would need to do an 8-step decision-making analysis because of this. And so this, again, if the project was CADX, the Clark Group would be taking care of this, but this would require 2 public comment periods, one to tell the public, hi, we have a project on the river, it's going to impact floodplains. The second public comment period will basically let them know, hi, we have a project on the river, but we're going to do this, this, and this as mitigation measures, and we're going to move forward with the project. So that's one of the scenarios for other federal requirements. And the other very common one is Section 106. So if your project, if you're doing a renovation on a historic structure or one that's eligible, so any building over 50 years old, we're going to have to do Section 106. And so again, if it's CADX, we'll take care of this for you, but we're probably going to have a lot of follow-up questions for you, like, can you send us pictures of the building? And please really detail what your renovation looks like, because the State Historic Preservation Officer is going to want that information. All right, so we're going to move on to still step 2, but now we're going to go over what does an EA determination look like? What does the process of creating an an environmental assessment look like? So again, you have the NEPA intake form, you send it to us to make a NEPA determination. We will give you guidance back, which is this arrow going back to you that basically says, hi, your project qualifies as requiring an environmental assessment. You are going to need to hire a contractor to draft the EA. These are very difficult documents to do, even for someone who's been developing EAs, they're difficult. And so you do need to hire a consultant to do this kind of work. So we're going to give you that instruction. We're going to let you know if you also need to take care of Section 106 or any other consultation requirements. So you're going to hire the consultant. We fortunately have a lot of products for the consultant to use. We have an EA template, things like that. We're going to go into that a little bit more. But basically, the consultant is going to draft your EA. They're going to send it to us. Once they're finished with the draft, they're going to send it to us for review. And our job as the Clark Group is to make sure that NBRC is compliant. So we're going to make sure that all of the federal requirements are met. We're going to make sure that NEPA is done completely. We're going to make sure there's mitigation measures and best management practices in there. And very importantly, that this document is ready for the public, because this is a public-facing document. And that's a really important part of NEPA, is that the public has an opportunity to hear what the project is and understand what our analysis is. So we're going to be looking for all of that. So there's going to be a couple rounds of revisions required. It's then, once we deem it ready for the public, it's going to go out for a 30-day public comment period where the public has the opportunity to ask questions about the project, ask questions about the analysis, and comment on the process. And usually we don't get any comments, but occasionally we do. Once that's done, we will issue, usually, almost always, we will issue what's called a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI, which basically says we've analyzed the project. We don't see there being any significant impacts to the human environment. We are recommending the project to move forward, and NBRC is going to fund the project because of that. right? So that's generally the process. And I'm now just going to go over like a little bit, like what does that look like? Because again, the EA process is definitely an arduous process. So I want to cover like what does that look like if your project does not qualify for a CADX and you have to go down this route. So the biggest thing, hiring your consultant. You need to hire a consultant to create a NEPA environmental assessment. There are a lot of like environmental type consultants out there. They do they do things that sound a lot like an environmental assessment, but they're different. And so when you hire someone, you need to make sure the NEPA that they are a NEPA environmental assessment, and that'll be in our guidance language. So you don't have to really remember that from this talk. But usually these consultants, they're going to be a little pricey, $10,000 to $15,000 based off the project details. So if your project's very complicated and it requires a lot of consultations for these other federal requirements, you're looking towards the higher end of this. So 10 to 15,000 is generally what we're looking at. Usually for NEPA, no money is, NBRC is not going to release any funds until NEPA is complete. However, there are some instances where NBRC, you can work with NBRC to receive what's called like a partial notice to proceed money. And then you can use that to hire your consultant, right? So this is a situation, if you realize you need an EA, you're going to need to work with NBRC to work around your budget. I don't really dabble in the budget stuff, but you would have to work with NBRC to figure that out. The other thing that you might run into is that for NEPA, in order to do a thorough assessment, we really need to have a good idea about your project scope or the details of your project. So if you kind of have a flimsy idea and the environmental assessment process is not going very well because you don't have enough details, you might again have to ask for a partial notice to proceed funds in order to get a better like preliminary design plan for your project. So this over here, this is a picture of Vinyl Haven, Maine. We had a project there. They knew they wanted to redo their pier for the lobstermen. They had a pretty good sense, but they got into the EA process and they were struggling with their analysis. And so basically they had to stop what they were doing. They had to ask NBRC for a partial notice to proceed money to hire a consultant to basically draft, like do a preliminary design of their project. So we recommend 25 to 30% design, just enough to get enough information to do your analysis, but not too much where you're already full in on the project, because that's the whole thing with NEPA. We don't want to get to the end of the analysis and say this is not a good option. So you don't want to go all in with your design. You just want enough in order to analyze the project. And so in that instance, we stopped. We waited for a preliminary design plan. And then once we got that, we went forward with the rest of the NEPA analysis. So we provide to the consultants, we have a NBRC EA template. It basically has very detailed instructions. We have guidance language. We have lots of examples. So we'll provide that to your consultant. We also sometimes can provide examples to your consultant if we have a very similar project that's been gone through the process already. So that's a good resource. And as far as I mentioned that it has to be reviewed by the Clark Group, the draft EA, once it's been completed or the draft's been completed by the consultant. Usually we're looking at 2 to 4 reviews if we've gone off of past examples. We are, however, in the middle of revising the EA template to provide even more instruction and even more examples. So we're really hoping to get the number of reviews down. Usually the review will take about 1 to 2 weeks on our end, just due to the amount of work and these, again, being pretty long documents. So usually 1 to 2 week wait time, and then 2 to 4 reviews necessary. But we are really trying to get it down to like 2 reviews tops moving forward. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the 30-day public comment process. This allows the public to review and provide feedback on the EA and the project, so it's both. Generally speaking, we don't get any comments. We've had, I think, one example in the recent past where we did receive some comments. But basically, when the draft EA is ready to go for the public, we will provide you, the grantee, a one-page notice, and you'll post that notice in a newspaper or a public forum to allow your stakeholders an opportunity. So you want to post it in a place where people who are going to be interested in the project have an opportunity to see the notice. So then the notice will be posted. That'll start the 30-day public comment period. If usually we don't receive the comments and we could just proceed with finalizing the EA and posting the FONSI or finding of no significant impact. If we do receive comments, we just address those appropriately. Sometimes we have to go back and do additional mitigation measures. For instance, here, this is a project we had maybe in New Hampshire. It was like a bike project where they wanted to put some bike paths in. And we had a couple comments from the public on where the bike path was going relative to wetlands. So we had to stop the environmental assessment. We went back out into the field, did some wetland delineations, basically figuring out where those wetlands are and making sure that the bike path didn't intersect the wetlands. Then we were able to move forward. We addressed the comments, said, we've done a better job, we've mitigated impacts, and we're moving forward with funding the project. All right, so that's kind of how that works. And this is a really good example of actually NEPA working. People that were closer to the project, the actual public that was close to this project, knew some things that maybe the consultant didn't know and were able to bring that to attention, and we were able to deal with it appropriately. And so great example of NEPA working, and it really didn't hold the project up that much either. So, okay, so the last thing I just want to reiterate, we've kind of touched on it already, is that NBRC projects are generally co-funded by other federal agencies or other state agencies. And many of these agencies have their own NEPA or NEPA-like process. And so, as I mentioned earlier, and it's really hard to say, like, yes, for sure, we can adopt another federal agency's NEPA process or state agencies. It really depends on the program that's attached to the agency. For instance, like New York State has their own NEPA-like process, but generally speaking, we can't use that unless there are, the funds come from the Clean Water or Drinking Water State revolving funds. So it's like, very specific details. But the important thing here is that if you can just, like I said in that NEPA intake form, if you can provide as much information on those other agencies as possible, and your point of contact, we'll reach out to them to figure this out if there's an opportunity. Because again, this can really quicken the process if we can piggyback off of what someone else is doing. All right, so this is the last slide. I just want to finish up by saying that it's NEPA, as I mentioned in I think one of the beginning slides, NEPA has to be done before you can move forward with that project. It has to be completed before you make it's called an irretrievable commitment to resources. And so that includes purchasing land, property, purchasing equipment, services. If we talked about a couple instances where you can reach out to NBRC for a partial notice to proceed if you need to hire a NEPA person, a consultant, or if you need a little bit more of a design plan. But that's something to determine that and to be able to use funds, you really need to talk to NBRC before you move forward with doing any of these actions. Because if you do, this could mean that, you aren't reimbursed for those funds. It can, it's just, we need to make sure we go through all these steps before you move forward with the project. So if you have any questions about this at all, if you have any questions about where you can spend money or not and when, definitely reach out to NBRC because they'll help you through that process and make sure that you don't go astray. And so, once we go through the NEPA process, NBRC is going to be very, very clear with you that the NEPA hold, they call it the NEPA hold being lifted, and that they will issue a notice to proceed, and they will let you know, like, go ahead, spend your money. So Yeah, that's the end of this, and I will stop sharing and open it up for questions. So I stop sharing.
I see a hand raised from Susan.
Second. Okay, yes.
So feel free to come off mute and ask your question.
See if we can unmute her. Andrea, do you have to allow, like, click and allow her to disable mic?
I think she's good. Susan, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, they're saying it's grayed out for them. They're unable to unmute.
Right. I went in and enabled the microphone.
Sorry. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, my question is, do you have a sample contract and a list of consultants who do these environmental assessments, NEPA environmental assessments?
So from NBRC, we do not have a list. Austin, feel free to chime in what we have directed our grantees to do. If you're already working with an engineering firm, some of those folks do have capacity and experience in other federal grant funding, and that may be something that they're able to do for you under a separate contract, obviously, from engineering for the complete project. If we don't require NEPA as a standalone to go through an open and competitive procurement, but you could certainly do an RFQ. So some very narrow qualifications of what you're looking for. It's also possible that your local development district, if you're working with an LDD for grant administration, they may also have some additional resources of people maybe that they've worked with, or actually even some of our LDD partners do have experience and capacity to do NEPA, and that would be a separate contract from grant administration. So those are primarily the ways we mentioned to our grantees, like how you can find someone to work with you. But Austin, like I said, feel free to chime in if there's other suggestions.
No.
So I just to be clear, we don't have to advertise it for 3 weeks and put it out. We can pick a firm and hire them, even if we are using NBRC funding after we've received the partial notice to proceed.
Yeah, so in terms of process, I would first wait for our NEPA determination on your project. It's in terms of like what are you going to be required to do to complete NEPA. If it's a CADX, for example, you likely won't need to go through an environmental consultant. If you're going to do an environmental assessment and there are some specific things you need to be aware of, you would want to have that guidance from us first before you started reaching out, so you could give the folks either through an RFQ, or if you're reaching out, kind of cold calling people, you could sort of provide to them, like, we need to complete an environmental assessment. Here are some specific things that our project entails, because you want to make sure that whoever you hire to do it has either done, maybe it's not NBRC, but is aware of NEPA and its requirements, and then if you do have to do an EA, for example, then I would suggest you reach out to NBRC. We want to make sure we get you a partial notice to proceed to cover some specific costs. So as Austin referred to during her presentation. It doesn't give you sort of a green light to do everything, but we would give you specific parameters under your partial notice to proceed, to give you access to some NBRC funding, to, you know, to then be able to secure a contract, execute a contract, and have some dollars to help pay for those costs, as an interim step to a full notice to proceed. And I think our session on last Monday did talk a little bit about the difference between a partial and a full notice to proceed as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I see a hand up from Michael Catania, if I said your name right. And I have, you have the ability to speak, so I've enabled your microphone, so you can certainly come off and ask your question. Are you there, Michael?
All right, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, I have a question about eligibility for the CADX. Our project is relatively straightforward. It involves mostly interior renovations to a building that's non-historic, with some additional development either attached to the building or adjacent to the building in an area that's already been disturbed. But so we would appear to be eligible for CADX, but there is one small aspect of the project that involves an all-persons trail. And in order to connect that to our existing trail, we are going to have to cross one little finger of wetlands. Would that automatically make us ineligible for a CADX to have any wetlands impact whatsoever?
It doesn't make you ineligible, but you know how I mentioned earlier, there's kind of this in-between space between CADXs and an EA, where you're
Yeah.
like, you get a CADX, but you might need to do an 8-step for wetlands. Like, without really analyzing your project, like just based off of what you're saying here, you know, it could be a situation where you have a CADX, but you have to go through the 8-step analysis for wetlands, where we come up with some mitigation measures to try to mitigate any impacts to the wetlands. And that would require that little public comment period that I had mentioned. But you could still be eligible for a CADX.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
I think I mentioned too that review is underway of all these projects, so we will be reaching out to you with NEPA guidance in the coming weeks, so you have a sense of where we landed on our determination of your project. So we are sort of in that in-between space as we conduct these new trainings, while that NEPA review and determination is ongoing. But we will be communicating with you so that you understand what your next steps need to be as it relates to NEPA.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I think the next hand I see is from a town administrator. It doesn't have a name, so let's hope that's the only one. But you have your hand up and your microphone has been enabled, so you can ask your question.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. I'm hoping that our project is CADX, and one of the qualifications you mentioned is a large project versus a large building versus a small building. And I'm wondering if there are metrics on that, or if it's just each project is evaluated on its own. In other words, can you define small versus large? It's cleared land. It's land that's already been cleared, so we're not disturbing it further than someone previously turned it from a forest to a meadow. So it's a 5,000 square foot building, and I'm just wondering if that's large or small. It's going to trigger EA.
Ooh, yes. So as I mentioned, the CADX list we have is very, very detailed. And so it'd be like, let me just. So it could, if it was less than 12,000 square feet, potentially, and less than 2 acres of surface area are involved.
Okay, that's good news for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, and just keep in mind, like, I hate kind of saying these answers on the fly because,
I
like I said,
understand.
there are a lot of nuances. So, like,
Sure.
don't get your hopes up too much. But, like,
Okay.
generally speaking, that's kind of what we were talking about.
Okay. 12,000 is definitely large, and I appreciate that. That's a good qualifier. Thanks.
Okay.
The next hand I see is from Becca Halter.
Andrea, so we have from our state historic office know there are some indigenous cultural resources on a property that's included in this project. And so for that section 106 consultation, who is the federal entity that would get involved and be the federal consultation with the indigenous tribe?
NBRC would.
Okay.
Yep. And if it sounds like for that situation, oftentimes we'll have a consultant, like if you have to do an EA, oftentimes we'll have the consultant kind of draft EA materials. But if it's, indigenous, for that situation, we'd probably, NBRC would want to be very involved to make sure that we're being sensitive to a sovereign nation. So NBRC would take the lead on that.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
The next hand I see is from Leanna Wilbur.
Thank you. When we initially submitted the NBRC NEPA intake form, that was back in May when the application started. And since that time frame, we did, one of our other funding sources has started their NEPA review piece. So how do we get that information into the form? Do you want us to redo the NEPA intake form and update it with that information? Or is there another alternative that you would like to see us use?
Did your original NEPA intake form include that other funder and some basic information? I think Austin showed kind of a template of the NEPA intake form and where you would include some of that information. So was that included in your initial intake form?
The original intake form did not include the congressional funding that we had. So at that point in time, we hadn't had it committed, so it was not part of that intake form. But since that time frame, it's been committed and we started that work with them.
Then yes, the best next step is an updated NEPA intake form.
Okay, and just submit that through the portal.
Yeah, through the GMS. You got it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. The next hand I see is from Town Administrator. I have unmuted your microphone, so it just says Town Administrator in terms of who's on my list. I don't actually have a name, but I have unmuted your microphone, so you're able to use it. So Town Administrator, if you want to ask your question.
In the chat, they said they can't unmute.
They can't unmute, but I have unmuted. I've enabled their microphone, so they would be able to speak.
Still unmute.
Okay. If you want to pop your question in the chat, we can read it out loud and address it that way. And in the meantime, I will move to Angela.
Hi, so we have a building that was a doctor's office. We haven't made any renovations to it, and we don't plan on making any renovations to it. So do we have to apply for the NEPA?
So all projects are required to complete NEPA. Did you include your NEPA intake form with your
Yes.
application? Okay.
Yes, we did. Yes.
And review of those is underway. So all of our spring round awardees NEPA review is underway. And we will be in touch with guidance on next steps. The trainings we're doing are sort of our interim step while other things are happening behind the scenes in parallel. And you would
Okay.
only need to update your NEPA intake form if something significant has changed from when you originally submitted it. Like the question before that there's now a funding source that's been committed. That's a pretty significant change. But if you have not had any changes and you submitted it with your original application, it's really just sitting tight and waiting for our next step guidance.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So folks, just so you know, it's a technical glitch that you don't have the ability to unmute. So if you raise your hand, what I am doing is enabling your microphone. So then you can actually speak and raise your question. But I think the town administrator question is the one, and it sounds like you've not been able to speak. So the question is in the chat. And it says our project is historic preservation and already has a Brun grant funded by MPS. NEPA and 106 should already be underway. Will this speed things up? Is the first part of the question.
Probably, yes.
Okay.
There's a good chance that will, especially if they're already doing it, that they might even complete it before we're there. So we could potentially adopt their analysis. Alternatively, we could work together with them, but they've already started the process. So yes, it should speed it up.
Okay. The second part of the question is that they're moving the building off the foundation to pour a new one and wondering if that would bounce their level up to an EA.
So if, let's say the National Park Service has already started their NEPA process, they have their own CADX list. And so I don't know what their CADX list looks like in this situation. So they might be able to CADX the process. And if they can CADX it, then we could still move forward with their approach. And then if I'm not even going to go on the alternative, it sounds like that National Park Service is definitely funding it. So I'm not sure if it would bounce them up to an EA.
Okay. Just double checking the chat. So Shane, your microphone has been unmuted, so you can ask your question.
Yeah, I mean, I put in the chat is there a scenario where a project is sort of a borderline CADX or a full NEPA where we can use our seeker to push us into the CADX category? 12 months is very troublesome for our project. So we're looking for a solution.
Yeah, that situation does not exist. It doesn't exist. It depends. So sometimes it depends who your funding program is, though, in New York. If you're getting funding, if the funding program is the Clean Water or Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, then we could use SECRA. If it's not, then there's nothing we could do there. And I guess I don't know anything about your project, so you're just assuming on its face that it probably is an EA?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. We've occasionally run into this and it's unfortunate, but.
We think it's close, but some of the things
All
you were
right.
saying sort of is leading us to believe you're going for the full, so.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's not really like super helpful is that I think SECRA is pretty involved. I think the analysis is pretty involved. So your consultant potentially could just use a lot of what is in there and kind of bring it over into the EA. which might speed up the process for sure, but yeah.
Yeah, even 6 months is a long time right now for us. So we're going to have to call, I think we're going to just reach out to NBRC and try to talk through some of this to see where we are.
Yeah, I would just encourage folks, like, I know everybody's anxious to get moving. There's several steps that happened, and NEPA is one of them that I would wait to get our determination before reaching out and asking to, revise a budget or do something, because chances are you might have to do it more than once. So I would just, I think at the outset, we were saying, like, this is really meant to so that you understand the requirements of your project. And once we give you the guidance and next steps, then that's the time for us to be having a conversation. For example, if you didn't include NEPA in your budget, or now your timeline is impacted because it's going to take longer than you expected, but those conversations would be preliminary now because the determination of your project hasn't yet been made. The next hand up I see is Anne.
Thank you. I appreciate this because I know for sure that I have been under some misconceptions about what I should do. We had some conversations about whether or not we needed to include NEPA in the budget, and we decided that we did not, because ours is a project that's very much business development programming. But if I'm understanding what I've learned today correctly, we still have to include that NEPA intake form and upload it onto the GMS as soon as possible. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, so the NEPA intake form is one of the application support documents. And if you did not include it in your initial submission, then you've probably received some communication from NBRC that it was missing and that you needed to complete it and upload it with some guidance on where that needed to happen. And from there, that's kind of where we are, is now Austin and her team are beginning their reviews of those projects and intake forms. And that's where we will follow up with next step guidance. So if, for instance, your project may be a CADX, there probably is not a reason to come to NBRC and ask for access to some money for NEPA, because you wouldn't need it. And that's what I mean by, I would encourage people to wait for that initial guidance, because that will give you much more information about what you need to do, a cost, and any adjustment you may need to make to your timeline. Those conversations would be really like premature to have right now.
Okay, so I think we're good. I just was double checking myself, because we did do it at the point of application, and there were lots of no's on that form. So I think we've done everything we need.
Awesome. Yeah,
Thank you.
and like I said, we would have reached out if the form wasn't there, or something seemed to be missing on it or something like that. So I would say if you haven't heard from us, you're in good shape.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, recognizing the time, last call for questions before we move into the next segment of our program. I don't see any other hands raised, so. So if you entered questions in the chat or somewhere else, I would just ask that you raise your hand so we can unmute your microphone and you can ask your question here with the group. I think, Lindsay, it looks like you have one question. I think you might be the one person we haven't heard your question that was entered in the chat, and I have enabled your microphone, so you're welcome to come off and ask that question.
Thanks, Andrea. I think I'm all set. My question was close to the last question that was asked. And if we're not a construction project at all, how far through this process do we have to go? But it sounds like if we haven't heard from you, that we're all set. for now.
If you haven't heard from us, then we're good with the form that you submitted, and now it's just going through the determination and next step guidance. So yep, I would say you are good.
There was another question in there about what is it wasn't mine, but I just pointing it out about a big project versus small project. But
yep, that was also in the chat, and that person asked that question. I looked at the Q&A, so
Great.
and cross-checked it with the chat. But
Awesome.
by all means, if I miss someone, please raise your hand, and I will enable your microphone. All right. So the second part of our session today is with respect to the Build America, Buy America Act. I would say this is very sort of 101 in that we're just trying to, again, similar to NEPA, flagging this as a requirement of you as a recipient of federal funding assistance. And today, our grant attorney, Rebecca Dormashkin, is going to give you a presentation on this Build America, Buy America. We will cover things such as what it is, how do projects comply with it, waiver opportunities, and again, there will be opportunity for further questions after her presentation. So Rebecca, with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, let me try to share my screen here as well. Andrea, can you confirm that you can just see my PowerPoint? It says Build America, Buy America 101.
I can see it. Yes, you are good. Thank you.
Oh. All right. So to begin, what is BABAA? The Build America, Buy America Act was enacted in 2021 as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. BABAA is intended to strengthen Buy America preferences associated with federal financial assistance for infrastructure, bolster America's industrial base, protect national security, and support high-paying jobs. The Act specifically states none of the funds made available for a federal financial assistance project for infrastructure may be obligated for a project unless all of the iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in the project are produced in the United States. At NBRC, BABAA applies to all federal financial assistance projects for infrastructure that were made on or after May 8th, 2023. The Buy America preference applies to the entire infrastructure project, even if it's funded by both federal and non-federal funds or under multiple awards. And the preference requirements must apply uniformly to both federal and non-federal shares. Per the regulations, a project means any activity related to the construction, alteration, maintenance, or repair of infrastructure in the United States. And infrastructure includes, at a minimum, the rehabilitation of buildings, real property, water systems, construction and improvement of roads, highways, bridges, utility installation, and broadband infrastructure improvements, just to name a few. This list is not exhaustive. Some examples of NBRC funded activity that is not subject to BABAA includes the acquisition of real property, the demolition or relocation of property, nor does the Buy America preference apply to equipment or furnishings such as chairs, desks, computer equipment, anything that's used at or within the finished infrastructure project but is not integral to the structure or permanently affixed to the infrastructure project. To cover the products that are covered, BABAA covers iron, steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. Under the regulations, iron or steel products means articles, materials, or supplies that consist wholly or predominantly of iron or steel or a combination of both. Construction materials includes non-ferrous metals, plastics, polymer-based products, glass, fiber, optic cable, lumber, engineered wood, and drywall, and that list is exhaustive and is included in the regulations. Manufactured products means articles, materials, or supplies that have been processed into a specific form and shape, or 2, combined with other articles, materials, or supplies to create a product with different properties than the individual articles, materials, or supplies. Some examples of manufactured products include an electrical vehicle charger, solar panels, or heat pumps. And then for iron and steel or construction materials to be deemed produced in the United States, all of the manufacturing processes must occur in the United States. For a manufactured product to be deemed produced in the United States, the product must be manufactured in the United States, and the cost of the components of the manufactured product that are mined, produced, or manufactured in the United States must be greater than 55% of the total cost of all the components of the manufactured products. And these definitions are included in the regulations, which I will cite to at the end of my presentation in case folks want to dig a little deeper or review these on their own. I'm next going to move on to compliance. So when planning projects, grantees should be planning them with BABAA in mind. That means working on your budgets and timelines. For example, some domestic items may take longer than something that you can get off the shelves from China. Additionally, BABAA requires a little bit more documentation for compliance. So just making sure that you have appropriate staff to make sure that you can, maintain those documents and keep track of, the different levels of documentation that are required. So there are 2 kind of levels of compliance for BABAA. First, grantees can comply with the requirements and document compliance. Alternatively, grantees should evaluate whether a compliance or whether a waiver may be available for their project. I'm going to start with what compliance would look like and some of the documentation efforts folks can go through. So as a recipient of federal financial assistance, you all are the ones that are ultimately responsible for compliance with BABAA and making sure that the BABAA requirements from the grant agreement flow down to contractors. As such, grantees should review their existing procurement policies and procedures to make sure that the Buy America requirements are included in the procurement documents and contracts. The Buy America requirement should be incorporated into all of the grantees' written agreements. That includes bidding documents, subawards, contracts, purchase orders for products that are supplied to complete the work. And grantees should maintain documentation in accordance with the applicable program requirements for record keeping and record retention, which you all will get a training on in the near future. That should include, though, maintaining copies of written communications with stakeholders about the Buy America preference and how requirements are being implemented. Without good documentation, it's impossible to demonstrate compliance when your project is eventually monitored. Grantees may require manufacturers to provide a certification letter for each item to which BABAA applies. I will review the recommended requirements of the certification letter on the next slide. Grantees may also require that contractors, as part of their services and duties, verify items delivered to the site and installed are accompanied by documentation of compliance with BABAA. They could request photographs of items as appropriate. They could facilitate delivery logs. Photographs and delivery logs could become a part of the construction record, which can be used as supporting information during audits to provide evidence of items that may be buried or otherwise inaccessible. And then lastly, NBRC's responsibilities include providing guidance on BABAA, answering BABAA applicability questions, conducting compliance oversight, coordinating with the Made in America office, processing your waiver requests, potentially reviewing market research, and so on. So the Made in America office has established evidentiary recommendations to substantiate compliance with BABAA, and that's what we are all recommending to you. The recommendations include for each item to which BABAA applies a manufacturer's certification letter demonstrating compliance. At a minimum, it's recommended that the certification letter should be signed and on company letterhead. it should identify the item that is being certified and affirm the item complies with BABAA. The letter should be provided to the construction contractors for all BABAA compliant items, which should then be provided to you all as federal financial recipients before a request to NBRC for reimbursement is made. Beyond the compliance via certification documentation, projects should evaluate whether or not the work will fall under a waiver. NBRC has limited, targeted, and conditional waivers. They're intended to cover specific items or periods of time to allow NBRC grantees in the private market to build capacity and respond to these new conditions. The waivers are not an alternate to increasing production, but a tool to promote investment in our domestic manufacturing base, strengthen supply chains, and position U.S. workers and businesses to compete globally. NBRC has 3 general applicability waivers. First is the de minimis waiver, and that allows for up to 5% of project costs to be procured non-domestically. The small grants waiver applies if the total cost of the project for all sources of funding is equal to or less than $250,000. And the third is the minor components waiver, and that allows for up to 5% of a non-domestic article or supply be incorporated into an iron or steel product. These general applicability waivers are available on NBRC's website under our BABAA page, and folks can review that if they want to read a little bit more on the requirements for these waivers. A waiver request form is not required for the general applicability waivers, but grantees should still consult with NBRC to ensure a note or some type of documentation is included in their project file. Additionally, the regulations allow for 3 project-specific waivers. These waivers do require a waiver request form, which can be found on our website under the BABAA page. Briefly, these 3 waiver categories are for non-availability, which means the product is not available or will not be available in a reasonable amount of time. A public interest waiver, which means the use of an American-made product would be inconsistent with the public interest. This waiver has a pretty high bar. Only a couple dozen have been granted by the Made in America office, and the evaluation is complicated and involves a pretty lengthy decision time. And lastly is the unreasonable cost waiver, which is applied when the use of an American-made product will increase the total project cost more than 25%. Like I said, the Made in America office is the office that is making the final determination on the waiver requests. These are the numbers of the waivers that they've approved for fiscal year 2024. And this is, for across all federal agencies. So as you can see, they're pretty limited in the waivers that are being granted, particularly the unreasonable cost waivers. So just to review, only grantees can apply for the project or product specific waivers. NBRC is not going to process or coordinate waiver requests from suppliers, distributors, manufacturers, or contractors. If it's determined that a waiver request is appropriate, it's the grantee's responsibility to provide information specific to the material manufactured, product, or construction material that the waiver is sought. Most of this information should be available to you all from the design phase or bid documents, and the information for the waiver request should include the item description, price, date required, project location, and the name and address of the proposed supplier. It's important to include a detailed written justification for the use of a non-domestic product in that waiver request form, and grantees should also show evidence of good faith effort to procure a domestically produced product. And like I said, the general applicability waivers do not require a waiver request, but should still be addressed with NBRC staff so that their files can be appropriately noted. For example, the de minimis waiver, which we expect a decent number of grantees to use. It's important for grantees to track the items and their costs to make sure that they're not going to add up to more than 5%, as once that 5% threshold is reached, then BABAA would be triggered. As I mentioned, the timeline for a project or product specific waiver is lengthy as it requires consultation with the Made in America office. That office is processing requests from every federal agency, and that's taking about 2 to 6 months right now. I just want to briefly review what that process looks like. You all would submit the waiver form that's available on our website to MBRC. We would take a look. There might be some back and forth to make sure that that form is complete. You know, if the waiver request is for non-availability, we may have to conduct additional market research. Once MBRC has had a look, we would send it over to the Made in America office for an initial review prior to posting on our website for a 15-day comment period. After that 15-day comment period, MBRC will evaluate the comments and decide whether or not any tweaks need to be made to the waiver. If it still makes sense to move forward with the waiver request. Once MBRC has approved or not approved waiver request, we'll send it over to the Made in America office for a final determination. And then MBRC would announce the decision and post the waiver online. And the waivers that we have granted so far are also available on our website under that BABAA page for folks to review. Some additional resources. So OMB, which is the office charged with implementing BABAA, has published a 25-page memo that just goes a little bit more detail into some of the definitions of some of the terms, talks a lot about the waivers and implementation so far. The federal regulations for BABAA are available at 2 CFR 184. Our website has some information. We have an FAQ page that we're trying to update pretty regularly. You can, of course, shoot us an email. And then the Made in America office also has a website, and they have posted waivers that have been submitted, that have been approved, not approved, that are pending, which may be helpful for you all to review in drafting your waivers if you find that they're applicable to your project. That's all I've got. I'm happy to take some questions if folks have them.
Thank you, Rebecca. So following suit, if you have a question, raise your hand and I will unmute your microphone. I will just offer, in addition to similar to what we are doing for NEPA guidance, we're also reviewing projects that we determine need to comply with BABAA. So you will get some suggestions from us in terms of, or guidance, I should say, from us as it relates to BABAA. So while today this information might feel a little bit much and kind of like what it means to you, you will be given guidance that your project does will need to comply with BABAA or not. So then I think this becomes a resource in understanding kind of best next steps. So just so you kind of know where we sit. We've got a lot of things behind the scenes happening. So I see, looks like Ellen, I think you are, you can,
Okay.
Yep, you're good.
Can you hear me? Okay, so we have someone who wants to make a donation in kind of a large generator for our project. And because it's a donation, it won't be paid for, but if it's on site, is that, I have no idea if a generator is made domestically or if parts are coming from abroad. And is that going to need, something like that going to need to comply if it's not being paid for with MBRC funds?
Whether or not it's being paid for by MBRC funds, I don't think is relevant, but I'm not sure if the fact that it's being donated changes the scenario, because it's not like the funds are matched funds or shared funds or something like that. So I would have to look into that and get back to you on that. If you want to shoot an email to the MBRC admin email and we can circle back with you.
Okay, so anything that's basically on site of a building that's being funded by NBRC funds would have to comply.
Yeah.
Regardless of the source and who's paying for it. Okay,
Yeah.
that's helpful. Okay, thank you. And I guess an addenda to that question is some of the complicated equipment, like mechanical equipment. Is there a rule of thumb of pieces and parts that can be made abroad and then assembled here in the US? It's probably in all the documentation, but I'm just asking rather than read through, you know, like if you were buying a heating unit and parts are coming from China, but it's assembled here in the US. I mean, is there a rule of thumb on the percent that can be coming from abroad?
Yeah, it has to be more than 55% to be compliant with BABAA. More than 55% has to be manufactured in the US to be compliant with BABAA.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised, but we'll just open it up one more time. This is the final piece of our presentation. So want to make sure if people have questions, they can ask them while we're together. And in the meantime, I'll just note a couple other pieces of housekeeping. So I mentioned, oh, I see Wendy has a question. So let me unmute your microphone. Okay, Wendy, you should be good to ask your question. Thank you.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Well, this has been a very informative for me. I am a builder working with some of the folks on this call. And one of my questions is about the documentation that's required for the project. And I'm looking for guidance on what this exactly should look like. And I'm trying to understand how these records or this information is to be maintained and submitted. So I'm looking for guidance on what that looks like, if possible.
I can just say, like, initially, broad strokes, the grantee is ultimately the one that is required to keep the documentation, and they're required to keep documentation for 3 years after project closeout. And it's really up to the grantee as well on how they want to facilitate the documentation. We're recommending that they request certifications from the contractors, that they request manufacturers, or that they request the certifications from the manufacturers. I'm not entirely sure what your role, are you a contractor or?
I am the contractor, yes.
Okay, yeah, so I would look to your grantee to see what it is that they are looking for from you, but we're recommending that you, as a contractor, that the grantee requires the contractor to seek certification letters from the manufacturer on all items that need to be BABAA compliant.
Okay.
I hope that's helpful.
It is. I just didn't know if there was a particular way. I know that we're going to be working with our clients, but I just didn't know if there was any type of guidance or best practice or anything like that that can provide that further guidance for us on how we should be providing this information. Some of our items will be large, like mechanical units and perhaps electrical equipment and things like that. While some of our other items are fairly small, and I just want to make sure we're doing it properly so that we can streamline everything and we don't have to revisit.
Yeah, luckily the size of the item doesn't matter. So kind of whatever, if it has to be BABAA compliant, the certification should exist kind of regardless. But there is like sample language and whatnot online for different terms and conditions or certification letters or whatnot that could also be helpful to incorporate into the documents that you're providing for manufacturers or that you're providing for your clients.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So I would just say sort of one sort of reminder just from this session that obviously review of your projects is ongoing as it relates to compliance with NEPA and also as it relates to BABAA. So there will be more information coming from NBRC as we look to next steps. This new grantee training is something we do as early on in the process as possible to make you aware of the requirements of you as a recipient of federal assistance and also those people on your team who might be working with you. So these resources will be made available on our website, both the slide deck and the recorded webinar will be both posted on our website for each of these training sessions. So there will be more information coming from us as we move toward getting funds obligated for your project and then issuing grant agreements. Grant agreements for us are essentially the contract between us as the funder and you as the grantee. So right now we are really kind of paper chasing a little bit. So we mentioned a little earlier if you were missing application support documents, or perhaps in some scenarios you were awarded a different amount than you requested, you would probably be asked to go back and correct your budget and probably an SF424 and some of those pieces. So there will be continued guidance coming from NBRC as we move through these next steps in the process. And just for a reminder for folks that we have 3 remaining sessions. So Wednesday's session will be dedicated to reporting requirements and our process around reporting and also for reimbursements. So that is Wednesday's session. And then there's 2 more next week for project oversight. We're going to talk about our procurement requirements, which kind of lead into some of the things you heard about today. Amendments. So when there are project changes, kind of what we have for an amendment process. And we will wrap up next Thursday with closeout. So there's a closeout process to your project, which seems hard to believe that we'd be talking about closeout when we're so, right at the beginning of your project, but really just trying to give you a large overview of the different segments and also NBRC's desk review process and our community visit initiative. So more to come in upcoming sessions. They do require registration. So if you haven't registered, we ask that you do so. And we've made all these PowerPoints available. And we'll continue to, sort of update our website. Just want to thank you for your time today. I know we've pretty much consumed the block, and apologies again for the technical assistance glitch on a Monday afternoon is never pretty. So just appreciate your patience and all the great questions that you asked. And then at the end of this recording, similar to our first session, we have some additional resources and key terms, which we all have our lingo in the federal funding world, and staff information. So our NBRC or admin@nbrc.gov is the best place for communications on your project. But I would say just sit tight for a little bit while we get through these sessions, and we will be giving you more guidance at each step of the way. And part of these trainings is really so that you feel like you have a connection to us and we're available and want to support you in any way we can. There's a lot to it. I often say getting the money is like step 3, because first you had to have a proposal and then you had to get an application together. And now we're kind of moving through probably the less fun part, which is some of the administration pieces. And we really want to make sure our folks know that we're here to help you because it is a lot to get through. So we hope you found today's session informative. And again, thank you for your time. And we will see you in a couple of days.
Andrea, can you stay on or can we jump on a
Thank you
call
very
afterwards?
much.
She looked. Hey. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I just want to stop the recording.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.